You were told to trust objective sources like data, the experts, and reputable institutions, as if their guidance and their numbers simply cannot lie. They're unbiased after all, right? And in many ways, that belief is what built the modern world. But what if objectivity is an illusion? Not because people are lying explicitly, but because they don't have to lie in order to still get away with peddling distortions in order to paint a narrative. Because every system that measures reality quietly reshapes it, observes it, and translates it. Every statistic begins with a selection of data, and every model begins with a set of assumptions. Every narrative moves in a certain direction, and once you see it, you realize something unsettling. You rarely, if ever, see reality directly for what it is, only versions of it, optimized for something or someone else, pointed along a certain vector, beholden to a background signal, shaping a narrative. The idea of objectivity, or being unbiased, is one of the most powerful inventions in human history. During the Enlightenment, thinkers like Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon helped formalize a vision of knowledge grounded in observation, measurement, and repeatability. And the promise was very simple. If we remove bias, emotion, and perspective, we can see reality as it truly is. And in many domains, that actually worked. Science gave us incredible predictive power. Statistics helped us understand populations and distributions. Journalism attempted to document events faithfully. And objectivity became synonymous with truth. Not your truth or my truth, but the truth. There's a hidden assumption in that idea, though, that reality can be observed without distorting it. And that assumption is not entirely true. Every attempt to measure reality requires choices. What do we measure and how do we define it? What do we ignore? Why would we ignore part of reality if it's real? Even something as simple as an unemployment rate depends on definitions. Who counts as unemployed or underemployed? Who is excluded? What duration qualifies as being out of work? And how many people really should be working for a paycheck on the books anyway? The numbers may look precise enough, like 4.2%, 4.3%, but the process that created it is not neutral. Consider a well-known example from the early 20th century. In the 1936 Literary Digest poll, a magazine surveyed over 2 million Americans to predict the outcome of the presidential election. The sample size was enormous. 2 million? That's enough to expect less than 0.1% margin of error if the sample size itself was representative. So the data appeared rigorous and the methodology seemed objective, and it was utterly, completely wrong. The poll predicted a decisive victory for Alf Landon, and instead, of course, Franklin Roosevelt won the election in a landslide. Not because the respondents or even the researchers were dishonest, but because the sample itself was just biased. The survey was conducted using telephone directories and automobile registrations, which at the time disproportionately represented wealthier Americans. The data was real, but its conclusion was wrong, because the system used to measure reality had already shaped it. And even outside of statistics, this pattern appears in the systems we use every day. When you search for something online, it feels like you're seeing the most relevant or accurate results. But platforms like Google don't simply retrieve information, they rank it. Based on hundreds of signals, relevance, authority, user behavior, and engagement patterns, to name a few. And similarly, recommendation systems on platforms like YouTube or TikTok don't show you what is most true. They show you what you are most likely to watch. So the result feels objective, but it's not. It's optimized. And optimization always implies a priority structure. You are not the one normally setting that priority structure. You know, when people hear the word bias, they often think of politics, left-wing versus right-wing media narratives, intentional manipulation, or burying the lead. But bias runs much deeper than that. It exists at multiple levels. Human perception is inherently biased. We simplify, filter, and prioritize information automatically. Institutions are biased. not necessarily because of ideology, but because of incentives. A news outlet optimizes for attention, and what grabs our attention is often threats. A company optimizes for profit, whether it sells to those who truly need its product or not. A government agency often optimizes for stability on a political terms time frame, and not necessarily the stability of a society at large. Even technical systems are biased. Algorithms reflect the data they're trained on, and data itself is increasingly synthetic or generated rather than measured. Models reflect the assumptions they're built with. As researcher Kathy O'Neill has argued, mathematical models can encode and amplify existing distortions, even when they appear objective on the surface, which leads to an important realization. Even a perfectly honest system will still produce biased outputs, because it must. We tend to think of facts as points of information, fixed, stable, and neutral, but a better way to think about them is this. A fact is not just a point, it's a vector. So it's got a magnitude and it has a direction to it. The magnitude is the data itself, and the direction comes from what was selected, what was excluded, how it was framed, and why it was presented. What is it suggesting when we read between the lines? Two sources can report the same underlying reality and point you in completely different directions. Not because either one is entirely false, but because each is oriented differently. And once you see this, something shifts. You stop asking, is this true or false, and start asking, what direction is this trying to point me in? The real danger isn't bias itself. Bias is unavoidable. The danger is believing that something is unbiased when it isn't, because that creates a false certainty. You've probably seen it before with statements like, but the data says, or the science is settled, or maybe the numbers don't lie. These statements feel authoritative, like they're objective and final, which sounds good enough, but they often conceal the very assumptions they depend on. And when people mistake projections for reality, they become more confident in their assumptions, not less. They're more certain, more divided, and more resistant to alternative interpretations. That's the danger of believing you're already seeing the world clearly by default, when in reality, you're seeing a version of it you want to see. So if perfect objectivity is impossible, does that mean truth just doesn't exist? No. It means objectivity is not a destination, it's a process of refinement, a process of correction and perspective taking. The scientific method itself acknowledges this. As Karl Popper argued, knowledge advances not by proving things absolutely true, but by continuously testing and correcting errors. Objectivity in practice is not the absence of bias. It is the keen awareness of bias and the attempt to continuously account for it. Not perfection, but approximation, humility, and the acceptance of an ever-incomplete account of things. You will never see reality without a lens. No one does. But you can learn to see and account for the filter of the lens itself, to notice the selection, the framing, and the incentives, to recognize that every claim points somewhere. And once you understand that, you don't become cynical, you become more precise. Because the goal is no longer to entirely eliminate bias. It's to understand and process its influence, and in doing so, you get a little closer to the truth. This has been Lumen et Ratio, Light and Reason.